PRovoke podcast is brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialists Marketeers. Support for this podcast comes from Notified, the integrated, intelligent and easy-to-use PR software. Get a free demo today at notified.com.
Hello everyone and welcome to the PRovoke Media podcast. I hope you're all doing okay out there. I'm Maja Pawinska Sims, the EMEA editor at PRovoke, and I'm joined today by two leaders from strategic comms consultancy Fourtold, Omar Mockbil and Tatu Liimatainen. Omar, Tatu, welcome.
Thank you, Maja. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much, Maja. Nice to be here.
It's lovely that you're both in the same room, actually. So this is going to be a really nice discussion. So just to give listeners a bit of background on my two guests today. First, Omar is a Swedish national who joined Fourtold in February this year as MD of its growing EU advocacy communications business in Brussels. He was previously at Hill & Knowlton in Brussels and has worked with corporate, NGO and association clients across a huge range of areas from AI and digitization, diversity and inclusion, the circular economy and sustainability, and has also worked with EU institutions in supporting their communications. My other guest, Tatu, is a Finnish national and EU Public Affairs Director at Fourtold, leading its public affairs practice. He's recently joined the private sector from the Finnish government, where he coordinated climate policy work. In Brussels, he's also worked for several years in EU institutions, including the European Commission Vice President's Cabinet, the European Parliament's Vice President's team, and a lobbying association. So we've got some very solid public affairs credentials from both of you today. Welcome. Fourtold itself, set up in 2013 by two former FTI execs, Debbie Paris and Matthew Ellis, based out of Oxford and Brussels, and it helps corporates engage with all kinds of EU institutional decision makers and stakeholders. So chaps, how are you doing? How is business at Fourtold?
It's going very well, thank you. We've had our summer break, which feels like quite a while ago now, and this sort of September through till Christmas period is usually quite a busy one. So all hands on deck and raring to go. A lot happening in Brussels.
Fantastic.
Exactly. COVID has been an exceptional time, but for us, the time has been good. Everything going good.
I'm really pleased to hear it. And now I want to focus on climate today with both of you, because it's a big area of specialism for you guys and the consultancy as a whole. The minds of many are focused on what COP26, the big summit, will hold next month, and what that might mean for businesses and organisations and governments around the world going forward. Just to give us some background on all of this, Omar, can you start with the big regulatory and policy milestones around climate and environment and sustainability that have led up to this point? Because this is not, it's very much headline news now, but this has been a long time coming, and arguably, this is not obviously not the end of the story. But how have we got to this point?
If I jump in here, actually, if we take a couple of steps back and we think like how sustainability, environmental topics, they have been in the discussion. So they may be relatively new to the boardroom discussions, but if we think of how they've been growing in the public consciousness, they've been there for a little while. So if we look back, for example, to the 80s, here in Europe, we had the acid rain issues, then followed by the ozone layer discussions in the 90s. So from those discussions, the same logic applies now to the climate discussion. So where we first had scientific discussion that brought it to our attention, then backed up by civil society concerns, and which then led to political action. So now what we're dealing with is no longer regional or national, what came to the ozone and maybe acid rain issues, but now we have a global climate crisis in our hands. And if we look at the accomplishments that we have had, we can always pinpoint to the Rio in 92 and Kyoto 97. So one could actually say that the climate has been there for quite some time, although it has not been possibly in the boardroom discussions.
So why is it now in the boardroom discussions?
I think that essentially things have changed quite a bit. I mean, obviously, as Tatu noted there, it's been in the public and political circles for some time, but obviously, proportionally speaking, let's say that the private sector has probably been a bit absent until more recent times, if I put it that way. I mean, we've had CSR around since the 50s, I believe, but I mean, sustainability only really crept up into the discussions in the 2000s. I mean, I back in the day when I was studying in the early 2000s, we were talking about CSR, and we were talking about organizations starting to include environmental activities and reporting in their annual reports. Some of them not doing that at that stage, and that's kind of become normalized. And obviously, more recently, we've had organizations taking up the baton of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and using those as pillars for sort of showcasing how they've been developing and moving forward. So I think there has been some momentum for some time, but I think probably what's changed is that a few different things. There's that the society has obviously evolved in quite profound ways. We're not looking at sustainable policies as just a nice to have in a business. I think businesses are today really increasingly joining the dots between the climate crisis and their bottom line. I think every company out there is seeing how they're vulnerable to climate and climate change, and private sector doesn't have that sort of blind spot that it might think that it had previously. I mean, organizations are seeing disruptions in their output, higher operational maintenance costs, scarcer natural resources. I mean, that's becoming quite normal now. So I think that change has happened pretty rapidly. And if you look at it from the perspective, I mean, you're seeing obviously the conversations that are happening at the World Economic Forum, the private sector there coming forward with leaders talking about a great reset. There's discussions going on about stakeholder capitalism. These conversations have changed quite a bit. I mean, from a regulatory perspective, if you want to look at it from that viewpoint, there's also been obviously an increased momentum behind increasing transparent disclosures from corporates and investors, for example, in ESG, if you look at that for an example. So, the European Commission has been pursuing multiple initiatives in this area. So, for example, the EU taxonomy. So that's a classification system providing definitions on environmentally sustainable economic activity. You've got the renewable sustainable finance strategy. So that's setting out a roadmap for action on international sustainable finance initiatives. So, I mean, there's a lot happening there, but I mean, the EU isn't just going alone on this. You've got in the US, for example, you've got the Securities and Exchange Commission looking at recommending mandatory company disclosures on climate risk and human capital, but they're also analyzing the different criteria used to define ESG funds. So we're starting to get into these conversations about definitions here. So it's getting really interesting. And of course, for you guys over in the UK, you've got your Financial Conduct Authority's roadmap, which is seeking to extend mandatory disclosures of climate-related risks and opportunities. So quite a lot happening. And if you look at all these measures together, they really do represent a significant recalibration of financial system, the business system, towards even more and greater disclosure and transparency on ESG issues.
All of which can only be a good thing. Are you hopeful that now the conversation has been reframed, that things will move forward rapidly? Now we've kind of, the ears of the private sector has been pricked up.
I think there has been a noticeable shift, actually, how the business world has positioned themselves when it comes to climate change. If we think that it's not that long ago when the climate change, it seemed to be a bit of an issue that only a few wanted to have a strong position on. It kind of felt like everybody was aware of the discussions, but they kind of at the same time hoped that they specifically would not be connected with climate change. But I think now things are absolutely different. So a growing number of companies all the time, they're measuring all their environmental footprints, life cycle emissions, and other environmental impacts. And actually what they're doing is that they're seeking how to get competitive edge on the sustainability front. So I think businesses, they have clearly read the signs of global megatrends. And for the decades to come, we're going to have environmental and climate legislation out there that is going to affect them. And if we look at all major markets, for example, the EU, US, Japan, China, they have made climate commitments to decarbonize their societies in the coming decades. So if this transition is going to happen, it's simply going to be an enormous market for these types of solutions. So I think many are reading the signs, and I see a clear shift in there.
And what do you think the outcome will be of COP26? How's that going to move the conversation forward to the next phase? Will it make a difference?
I think there's going to be a lot coming out of it. I think in some respects, but then on the other hand, I think it's been quite clear for some time in terms of what organizations have been committing to at the moment. So this is just another milestone in the ever-evolving sustainability conversation. As you noted earlier, this has been going for some time and will continue to do so. I think the changes now is that it's starting to become much more embedded and it's becoming much more standardized, and regulations and all the activities of organizations are being built on in that sense.
I think hats off to the UK who is pulling this, because this is not an easy time to pull through global climate negotiations that are already inherently very difficult and complex. So had to cancel last year. The environment for discussions is not what it used to be. So I think that has to be put into a context as well. And if just about the COPs briefly, I think the Paris Agreement COP, the COP21 actually, it kind of set the bar in many people's minds for these COP meetings. And it's been a measuring stick that there is something great always coming out from them. But actually, we have had these 24 other COPs as well. So I think it's not always fair to compare to this COP21 that then gave birth to the Paris Agreement. But at the moment, I see these are exactly a little different. So you cannot compare the two. Here, I don't think we will get a super big announcement or an agreement like in Paris, but actually this is following from Paris, and we're looking like how can everyone do more and how can they increase their ambition. So I think there we hopefully will see developments and new commitments from countries around the world.
And what will all this mean, dialing this back to our world, what will all this mean for public affairs and corporate communications consultants, and how you're advising your clients across the private and public sectors?
I think it's a very important point, because we've talked about how this has been an evolving space, but it's important to note that even compared to just even a few years ago, it is a very, very full and very, very noisy space. Everyone and their grandmother is talking about sustainability. So there's a lot to be considered there compared to just even a few years ago. So a couple of factors I think that organizations need to bear in mind is that anybody who's using the S word today is going to be put under a lot of scrutiny. So if you couple that with the growing appetite from a legislative perspective, companies, there is an appetite for companies to be changed through regulatory and legislative reforms. So, if from a messaging perspective, from a corporate positioning perspective, it's more important than ever before. But what does that actually mean today? It means that you can't just come back with those same old messages. You have to stand out today and really use proof points and provide evidence as well as an intention. So, I mean, I think one point to probably note here as well, and it's important to address, I think, is credibility. I think you need to have that legitimate contribution to society today. It's not using nice big words in the ways that we did previously doesn't work. There's an issue here to address in terms of greenwashing, and I think that's important to address here as well. I like the definition of the French Agency for Ecological Transition, who in their anti-greenwashing guide noted as the use of the ecological argument when the benefit of the product or the service to the environment is minimal, even non-existent. In short, a message that could mislead the consumer about the real ecological quality of the product or about the reality of the fair trade approach. I think that sort of skepticism and critical thinking on these issues is happening quite a bit. So I think from an organization's perspective, it can seem very overwhelming in terms of how to adapt, because frankly speaking, companies' lives are more complicated than they've ever been before, where an organization is on one hand being asked to promote its actions to preserve the environment, but on the other side, it's obviously exposing itself to criticism.
Yeah. It's an interesting communications conundrum, isn't it? It's like balancing those two things.
Yeah,
it's indeed. But if we think that what we get out from COP26, the direction is clear. Everybody is expecting to get more ambition. So if we get more ambition, that also means hopefully more action than in practice. And in a very pragmatic terms, then all the actors, they have to see that how do we meet this new ambition? Now we think of the EU, for example, the Fit for 55 package already setting the scene how the EU is going to progress on this. But I think exactly that's important. What Omar touched upon is that how individual companies, how they can make themselves heard also in this regulatory discussion, that how can they have meaningful discussions with the policymakers wherever they are. So if I could give a couple of concrete advice, I think one is that you just have to be present where the discussions are taking place. Me, when I came to Brussels the first time, it opened the door to a completely new world, and I realized that people are deciding things in Brussels that I never had heard about. And that was an eye-opener for me. And the benefit, of course, if you are present on the ground, then you can actually provide solutions to these problems. So it can sound obvious, but having worked in the Commission and also in the European Parliament, for example, I don't think there's anything much nicer for a politician or a civil servant than actually a visitor who can help them solve these issues. And climate change is a big issue. So this doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to agree on everything, but if you can provide concrete solutions to the issues at hand, they always have a better chance to move forward.
Yeah. And I think just to build on that a little bit so that's from the public affairs perspective, if you look at the sort of communication side and preparing yourself, I think there's a couple rules of thumb in a way that organizations need to think about, especially today. I think, publicly acknowledging the complexities of sustainability is really important. I think, we're all finding our way through this. This is something new and nobody's perfect at the moment. There's going to be some trial and error. So I think transparency and credibility is really key. I think we have to understand indeed that these can be seen as very real, sometimes scary conversations for people to have. People can feel overwhelmed by climate change. And so I think a real understanding and empathy on the sustainability issues and the real world experiences of people around these issues. I think another thing which comes up around these COP meetings is obviously you have these 10-year plans or plans to 2030 and 40 and 50, which is admirable. But I think where we're standing today, there is an expectation of people around you to say, what are you doing now to improve your sustainability credentials? An organization perhaps might be getting its house in order as it is at the moment. And obviously you don't want that to make headline news. But I think if an organization wants to put sustainability at the core part of their communications, they really clearly need to define and understand what is their greatest contribution to legitimately contribute to society and the environment around us. And I think another last piece of advice maybe I'd give for organizations at this stage is sort of, people are looking for radical action. They're not looking for incrementalism. So I think it's important to bear that in mind.
So how do you bridge the gap, though, between policy and people? Because it's even more of a challenge these days, isn't it, to effectively connect science, policy, facts, these high-level discussions at a global, governmental and corporate level with consumers, as you say, who can get very overwhelmed by conversations about climate change. And, that you've got all the emotion that we as human beings have at that end of the spectrum. What kind of messaging is most effective to kind of bridge that gap and inspire hope, inspire behavioural change or action at the citizen level?
I think hope is indeed very important in today's discussion, because otherwise the outlook can look very grim. And people, they can maybe feel a bit powerless, but I would say as a comforting thought that if we are indeed to become climate neutral by 2050, 2060, whenever, actually action will be needed on all levels and from everybody. So this includes countries, regions, corporates, and individuals. And people might feel a little powerless when they are looking at these high-level discussions, and that's absolutely understandable. But there's a reason why some of these discussions are being held on a high level, because that is the way to resolve global challenges like climate change. So we do need also the high-level discussion. I think I would also like to bring the perspective for the problem at hand here. So it's good to remember that globally, actually, around 3/4 of the global emissions, they originate from the energy sector. So the energy sector is at the center of this issue. And of course, it means that the biggest solutions, they will have to also be found in the energy sector. So, and not all of us, at least not me, so I'm not an owner of a big energy facility or a company, but that doesn't mean that I cannot do my piece in my daily life. And we can think, for example, how do we travel? How do we heat our homes? What do we eat? And how do we consume in general? And I think that people, they are looking into these kind of things and this information more and more thoroughly all the time. And just to add on that, I think at the moment, people are having more information available than ever before, taking into account, of course, global differences, but never has there been a time when such a detailed discussion on climate change was possible.
And maybe just to add to that, I think as well, and maybe wearing my Swedish hat here to some extent here, you're having climate advocates like Greta Thunberg, who perhaps at some point in time would have been considered outliers in society, are now mainstream and growing in voice. So the voice of the individual and the power of the individual is greater than it has been before, I think. And it's not to be underestimated, the power of the individual in that respect, and all those points that Tatu mentioned there. And I think that's
interesting. Do you think, asking you both something, maybe a slightly controversial question, you guys know your stuff. Do you think the communications and PR consultancy world outside public affairs and policy specialists really understands at a deep enough level to advise clients around issues, the policy landscape around the climate crisis? Because, that there's a danger there that just maybe a lack of deep understanding or knowledge would spur campaigns in the direction of something that might look like greenwashing if you didn't really kind of get to the nub of the issues. How good are we getting at this as communicators?
It's a really good point, and I think communication is key there. You've hit it on the head there. It's essentially just communicating and making sure you're not in your own little siloed bubble where you're having your insular conversations about how great you are as an organization internally and speaking outwards and not listening. So it's about getting in there and listening. And I think coming back to Tatu's point there earlier, you need to be present on the ground. It's in your benefit as an organization to firstly be present so that you're aware of the conversations that are happening. You have a little bit of a benchmark, a little bit of mirror to yourself. I mean, we find it very interesting as a consultancy very often, where an organization oftentimes is looking to us to have an understanding of a kind of benchmark of how do they stand compared to what other people are saying. And so we try to put up that mirror and that lens to critically analyze and say, hey, you're at this stage of your journey and you should be coming here. But I think being present helps quite a lot in those engagements, in those conversations, and just not insulating yourself.
Exactly. And of course, background in the topics helps as well. But I can also say that this is an area that is developing all the time. So it is an enormous field, which is not that easy to master. So if we think, for example, science around climate change, it's developing all the time. So I feel a bit that you can do that much with the information that you have at hand. But of course, when you're providing that information, then credibility and transparency are really, really the key issues.
Yeah. So that collaborative mindset is really, really key.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing for me as an outsider to all of this. Feels like it's leading to something of a real tipping point in everybody's action and understanding is the fact that it's not just at the policy level, at national or even global level. It's not just that there is now corporate impetus for change, and it's not just NGOs kind of banging on that we've got to sort stuff out as far as the climate and the environment are concerned. It's all three working together for the first time, isn't it? Which does feel like things might actually make a difference, which I think, you know, circles back to that whole thing that we can be hopeful that there is now momentum to move forward for good on all those fronts without anyone blocking anything. So yeah, it's a really interesting time to be observing this, isn't it? Where the overwhelming feeling has been for some time that we're calling it the climate crisis now. We're being honest that we're at a really important juncture. But you know, the fact is there is so much going on in the background that maybe consumers aren't hearing enough about.
Indeed, we can paint a grim picture, but at the same time, if being hopeful, there has been development at the same time. So for example, if we think of the Paris Agreement, it covers 70% of the global emissions. Now, that's of course not 100%, so we cannot be happy that we're there already, but one could say that the level of commitment, at least, it's going to the right direction. But now we need to really look how we do the transition in practice. So the numbers, they are just not going to be enough anymore. But indeed, as you said, I would not be losing faith at this point yet, because there is more discussion on climate change than ever before. And if we look at what is happening globally, like I mentioned earlier, several major economies like the EU, US, Japan, South Korea, they have committed becoming climate neutral by 2050 and China by 2060. So we can see where this development is heading. So I would not be losing faith at the moment.
Okay. Omar, any closing thoughts on that climate discussion?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm a natural optimist, but I do feel that all the indicators in terms of the actions that are happening support my optimism in this regard as well. I think, as Tatu said there, the winds of change are there, and people have read what's on the wall. I grew up in the Emirates. It's an economy that's traditionally dependent on fossil fuel revenues. And then they've seen what's coming. They've pledged to fully decarbonize the economy by 2050, and they're doing their investments and challenges there. The EU, the US, China. I mean, people are pulling down the same direction, and there will be bumps along the way. There certainly will. But the trend is really there compared to even just a few years ago. It's incredible how fast this conversation has become a core part of what's spoken about in the corridors of Brussels.
That is indeed extremely hopeful. I just wanted to ask you both before we go. I just want to see what Brexit looks like in Brussels at the moment, because in the UK, we feel like we're very much at the sharp end, and the fallout has been messy and disastrous to the surprise of absolutely no one who voted Remain. How is it looking from the Brussels point of view? Is Brexit even a thing for you guys anymore? It's
an interesting topic. I mean, I think on the island and across the pond here, across the way here, on the continent, I think we're all quite bogged down with a lot of information on that. And I think there came a point probably where there was a little bit of tiredness on the topic here. So in terms of the discussions on Brexit, that's probably gone down the hierarchy of list of discussion points in Brussels. Having said that, though, when it comes to sustainability and it comes to these areas, there's a lot of cooperation still happening. I mean, obviously, the UK is hosting COP this year, and there are other activities taking place. But no, organizations in the UK, at least I can say, who were more present in Brussels are more present than they have been before. You're seeing a lot of British organizations or British-based organizations present in the UK, in Brussels, and having discussions and engaging in probably more than they were previously to some extent.
I would agree. I think all the actors in the UK now have to activate in a bit of a different way in Brussels, and this can be seen here. But what comes to actual Brexit discussions, there was a time when the debate and visibility was more heated, but I think now it has gone a bit to the I wouldn't say to the back burner, but it's not that topical at the moment what comes to EU policy landscape.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that perspective. That's really useful, actually, and also quite really positive that those discussions are still taking place regardless of what's gone on. Guys, thank you so much for your time and knowledge and expertise today. It's been really great to listen to such a to your knowledge and your hopefulness and optimism about what the conversation around climate and sustainability. So thank you both very much.
Thank you as well, and I hope it was useful for the listeners as well.
Thanks a lot, Maja. Thanks a lot for having us.
You have been listening to the PRovoke podcast, brought to you by PRovoke Media and produced by the international broadcast specialists Marketeers. Support for this podcast comes from Notified, the integrated, intelligent and easy-to-use PR software. Get a free demo today at notified.com.